And welcome to Let 'Em Talk. I'm Paul D'Arienzo, and we have a great show in store for you. Well, you know, this November, we're in November, marks 100 years since the Russian Revolution. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Russian Revolution. That was a long time ago. We're not talking about rock and roll or chess, or we're not talking about Putin or Yeltsin or Gorbachev, but way back in the beginning days, when it all started, it was a person named Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. And he led a revolution that actually did more to change Russia than probably any person in its history, because it went from a very medieval, poor country, peasant nation, totally based on agriculture, with a king who had roots going back 1,000 years, to basically a modern state that was able to surprisingly defend itself against invasion by much, much more powerful nations. That said, listen, I'm not going to apologize for things that happened that I don't agree with. Let's just say the Russian Revolution, to me, is something we can learn from. We cannot dismiss it. We cannot just say, well, because certain things didn't turn out the way we wanted them to, this whole thing was a bad idea. No. We have to realize this was the first attempt at a revolution. Mistakes were made, and we must learn from them in the future. That's my view. So towards that end, and we have behind me, we're going to play Sergei Eisenstein's famous film, October, often called 10 Days That Shook the World, which is his film expose of the Russian Revolution. Of course, I've read Jack Reed's book, 10 Days That Shook the World. And 10 Days That Shook the World. Why was it 10 days that shook the world? My guest, Dakotah Lillya. I almost forgot to introduce you. Welcome, you know. This is such a big issue. I mean, we're looking at the big thing now. This is the big picture, right? Mm-hmm. Hundreds of years, 100 years now since these days happened. So Dakotah Lillya, you're a student activist, and you're an expert on this history, and you were recommended to me as someone who could really sort of clarify what the Russian Revolution means to us today in the 21st century, what this event that happened at the beginning of the 20th century and defined the 20th century says for us today in the 21st century. So welcome to Let Them Talk.
Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you on. And now with that out of the way, let's go straight to the question. I'm champing at the bit. Why is the Russian Revolution something we should think about today? Why isn't it just something to be lost and forgotten in the midst of history, a dead end, something that failed, but instead something that people should think about today?
Well, I mean, the Russian Revolution represented at the time and still today, you know, the first challenge to the global capitalist system.
Right.
You know, a challenge to the way things were, a challenge to the mainstream. You know, it was a force that took a nation completely agrarian, completely illiterate almost, high levels of illiteracy, poverty, you know,
just read any of the novels of that period.
Yeah.
Right? You know, I mean, you know, Gogol, what you name it, you know, the stories, Dickens had nothing on Russian society and its bureaucratic nature at the time as well.
Oh, yeah.
And also the fact that it had these czars who had absolute power.
Yeah, I mean, it was a complete monarchy.
Right. Although I have to give Russia this, they seem to end serfdom, which is their version of slavery, with much less bloodshed than the United States ended slavery.
Oh, definitely. You know, the Civil War represents, you know, the deadliest war in United States history.
The Russians knew how to compromise.
Yeah.
Right, to quote our president, they compromised on it. The government basically bought all their slaves from the owners, compensated them, and then released them and freed them.
Yeah.
I don't know if that would have been possible in the United States for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
Once the serfs were Russians as well as the people who held them, and there was a long history of serfdom where people actually liked being serfs in some cases, as unusual as that might seem.
Yeah.
Right? And you were allowed to have your own work and own property, and you had many more rights as a serf than a slave would have.
Yeah.
But Russia was a serf country. What is a serf, really? You know, tell me more about what it was like before the revolution.
Well, again, before the revolution, you know, things were not really good for anyone but those at the top. You know, women didn't have any rights. again, like I said, illiteracy was super high, poverty was super high, hunger was constant, famine was an ever-occurring thing that people constantly thought about and constantly had to deal with every few years. Housing was dilapidated.
What's a famine? I was surprised. No, I brought this question up in one of my classes, and I had to explain. Nobody knew what famine was.
Well, I mean, not having enough food, whether it's man-made or nature, just not having enough food. And that was already the case for so many Russians.
But Russia was always, even then, it was potentially a very rich country. It had vast agricultural resources even then. I mean, Americans who went there in the 19th century were amazed by how much wheat they produced and corn and other, things they produced there. Why were the people unable to eat in a country that was verdant?
Well, I mean, it's the same, if you look at Africa, one of the most mineral and resource-rich places in the world, but still very much affected by, social problems like HIV/AIDS and illiteracy and poverty. It's because these materials are not in the hands of the people that, do the work. They're not in the hands of the general population, the people. It's being used to make a profit. It's being used by those at the top.
So it wasn't trickling down to the people on the bottom. They were doing the work, but they weren't getting any of the benefit of that work. There was a tremendous, and let's focus on that a little bit more, the division between rich and poor. There was no real middle class like we have here.
Oh, no.
There was just a tiny number of rich people, and everybody else was at the bottom.
Yeah, there was the reason there was such a tiny group at the top was because there were so many people at the bottom. Right. In order to have an oppressed class, you needed an oppressor. Right.
So these kings are called Czars, right? And there were a series of Czars that were from the same family, the Romanov family, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going like this is my movie history. I saw Reds too, right? And so they had these Czars, and these Czars, some of them were effective rulers and others were less effective, but generally there seemed to be a growing animosity towards these rulers over the course of the 19th century. And was there, how free were you, and what would happen to you if you were caught organizing any sort of resistance to these people, the Czars?
Nothing good. I mean, it took, a revolution to actually give a voice to the people. Again, they were oppressed by...
Didn't they have a Duma? Didn't they have a Congress or something like that?
They did, but it wasn't not the way really any legislature is supposed to work. Kind of a show legislature, really.
I see. So the king was absolute.
Yeah.
He said anything he wanted to, right? And his name was Nicholas, and his wife was Alexandra, and Anastasia screamed in vain.
Yeah.
Right? And we know the song. So that all said, and obviously pop culture has absorbed a lot of this, and the movies and books and what have you. So a lot of our listeners might know that, or can look into the pop culture to see, to read about what these people were like and what their society was like. But things started to come to a head in the early 1900s. Late 1800s, early 1900s, what changed that things started to really come to a head, that there started to be a growing confrontation between rich and poor?
Well, I think one of the big precursors for the revolution was the First World War. I mean, the revolution happened in 1917, a year before the First World War ended. And people, they saw the Tsar sending Russian people to die, and, these imperialistic, wars between all the major empires, the British, the French, the Austro-Hungarians, Germans, and then later the Americans. Wars aren't good sometimes they're good for popular opinion, but in this case they weren't, because they were being sent to die for the Tsar.
Now, I've been seeing a lot of revisionist histories of the Russian Revolution in the last few weeks. I've been reading here and there, and one was that a Russian historian saying today, a right-wing Russian historian saying, if it wasn't for the revolution, we would have won World War I, and we would have been at the table, with the other countries, taking apart Germany, and they never would have attacked us. Do you think that Russia had any chance of winning World War I?
Well, I'm not sure, honestly. I think, of course, there was a chance, but I don't think it really matters at the end of it, because if they participated in the Treaty of Versailles, which is largely seen as a cause for the Second World War, among many other things, I don't think it would have made any difference.
Right. They would have just been part of the people who would have annoyed the Germans to the point of hiring Hitler to lead them.
Yeah.
Right. So it wouldn't have really changed much either way. And Russia would have been maybe, well, wasn't there there was sort of a third force outside of the communists. And I want to get into why the communists became so powerful in Russia and not in other places. I mean, they were powerful in other countries, but I mean, Karl Marx, my understanding, said that the most industrial countries like the United States, England, France would be the ones that would have communist revolutions because there was a necessary precursor of industrialization, which Russia really didn't have.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the question always comes up, how is it that Russia, and then after Russia, China, had these like less and less developed countries had revolutions, eventually ending up in places like Vietnam and Africa and things like that, decolonization. And Germany almost had a revolution, but it failed. Mm-hmm. And France, United States, England never even came near that. I mean, they had they had Reds and they had definitely movements in these countries, but they never were more than they are today, really.
Yeah, and I think that's a question that people are still asking themselves today. Again, Russia, China, Cuba, countries that have had some of the most successful communist revolutions, completely flies in the face of what Marx said would happen. And that's why I think it's important to kind of not be dogmatic, in our belief in Marxism, in what Marx said, because obviously, applications of certain things aren't always the case. Mm-hmm. It just so happened that the timing was right in Russia in 1917 that it happened. I think it may have had something to do with the fact that there was such a large section of the population that still identified and still was the peasantry, so it all depends on the social conditions of the countries. Plus, after that, communist movements were so suppressed in all of the other countries, the United States, Britain, France, that it made organizing a revolution much harder.
Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people like to talk about, that the Soviet Union marked the end of communism, but Marxism might have actually, maybe we're looking really at the first attempt, mm-hmm. right? And with all the complexities that happen from a first attempt.
Yeah.
Right. And France, for example, had a revolution in the 1700s, and it was a long time, and they went back and forth before they ever established. It was another 100 years before they established anything close to a democracy. Mm-hmm. Although that's what was the claim of the revolution when they first had it. Right. It took 100 years. Right. So just because you have a revolution doesn't mean everything's going to just be hunky-dory. Yeah. Right after that. Right, it's just the beginning of the next phase of the struggle. But let's talk about more the people. What was special about? We're talking about the social conditions, but were there other things? I mean, there were the people involved, the leaders. I mean, they had some unusual leaders. I mean, Lenin, Trotsky. I mean, the different communists support their different groups and hate the other ones, but I don't really care. I'm interested in them all. You had Lenin, you had Trotsky, you had in Russia people like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. You had, and they were allied. Weren't they allied? Right? What was it about these people? What did they have that our leaders seem to fail? Why don't we have why didn't Jarvis Tyner take America into the 21st century? Why was Lenin able to do it? What did he have?
Well, he was very charismatic. Lenin was super charismatic, and he applied, the teachings of Marx. He wrote Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. He took what Marx said and he expanded upon it, in a really beautiful way that we still look at today. Same with Rosa Luxemburg, all these really great leaders. And I think, in other countries there have been good leaders mm-hmm. that have embodied these ideals. Yeah. Like even in the United States, we had Eugene Debs and William Z. Foster and the Black Panthers and, all these groups that have tried mm-hmm. These revolutions, but again, the suppression that they faced. Debs was jailed, COINTELPRO for the Black Panthers, William Z. Foster was jailed. They recognized the threat that there was to capitalism, and they did their best to snuff it out, and they have been largely successful so far.
A little known fact, right? The United States invaded Russia
mm-hmm.
in 1917.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about that? Because I think nobody really knows that. Very few people know that.
Well, it wasn't only the United States, correct? It was Britain and France as well, I think. Mm-hmm. They tried to extinguish the flame of the revolution, really.
There was a long civil war as well, right?
It was a very long civil war in Russia. Yeah, and these other countries that saw the threat of the revolution, and this goes back to certain theories that Marxists have about socialism in one country or global revolution and stuff like that. They feared it spreading, so they did their best to try to contain it. And while they may have contained it, they didn't extinguish it.
Let's look at Kerensky. Getting back to what I was talking about earlier, Kerensky was probably wanted to establish a similar type of system that they finally did get in the Soviet Union, when it became Russia in 1989, a sort of European-style democratic capitalistic state under bourgeois rule, as opposed to the aristocracy represented by the kings of the past. So, how is it that what happened with I knew his son actually. He had a show at WBAI.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he did. And he had a show for years at BAI, Kerensky's son. Well, he left in exile. He obviously didn't become the leader of Russia, right? How come Russia didn't follow? How come it took 100 years for it to get onto the track of sort of like where it might have actually been heading if it wasn't for Lenin, of a state that was a how can I describe it? Like a capital, a standard capitalist state that in the mold of the countries that were set up after World War I.
Again, that's another question that people still ask themselves today. It's very complicated. The way Russian society is organized and the way it was organized and the way it is today. After the fall of the Soviet Union, people in the Soviet Union actually voted overwhelmingly to preserve the Soviet Union. I think 77% or upwards of 70% voted to preserve the Soviet Union. And it took until the election of Boris Yeltsin, with the help of the United States. You can look at Time magazine covers saying how the United States made it so that Yeltsin was the leader of Russia. They didn't go without a fight.
And so there was a coup, you're saying. There was originally a coup that was sponsored by the United States. And wasn't there the communists tried to regain power at one point? And I remember being up all night and watching the fighting going on at the what effect does that have on Russia today? I mean, how do people feel in looking back at Russia today, looking back on this incredibly colorful history that's still playing out to this very moment? How do they process all of this if you're a Russian person?
Well, a lot of Russians actually still have nostalgia for the Soviet Union, and you can ask a lot of Russian people. They consider Stalin and Lenin as some of the greatest people in Russian history. They yearn for the times when there was full employment and social protections and all these different things that the Soviet society offered to them. And the largest party, or the second largest party in the Russian Federation, is the Communist Party, the official successor to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So it still permeates, many, many aspects of daily life.
I see. So it hasn't been totally rejected, is what you're saying, that a certain segment. But how about the young people in Russia? I mean, I'm sure that's the older people who always look to the past and make Russia great again. But and it was great at one time, and it had this great empire. A third of the world was really in the Russian orbit, and 2/3 in the American orbit, which is probably why it couldn't really exist forever under those circumstances. But what are the young people in Russia today thinking? I mean, are you in contact? What are they,
Well, I went to Russia a few weeks ago, actually, for the World Federation of Youth and Students, and I met so many Russian young people with not only the Communist Party, but with the Party of Communists, different the League of Lenin, all these different organizations, and they are thriving. They do have, thousands of members, and they are active, much more than many leftist organizations in the United States.
How do they get along with President Putin?
It depends which group. They all have their own different opinions, and even within the parties, there are different, some people say the Communist Party of the Russian Federation is too parliamentarian, for example. Other people see Putin as bringing the oligarchs under control and being a counterweight to American imperialism. Some people see him as a thief. It's a lot of different opinions, all from people saying they support the same thing.
I see. Right. So what is it about Putin that he is? So he took his shirt off. You know, he rides a horse.
Many times.
Right. But what is it about him that, you know, he's not a tall guy. He doesn't look a big, he's strong, but he's not a big, tall, warrior-looking guy. I mean, you know, he sort of reminds me of when he puts on a helmet, he looks a little bit like the guy who ran for president in '88, who we don't even remember anymore, was the governor of Massachusetts, and he put on a tank helmet, and that, like, lost election, right? Remember that picture? I forget his name, but you know, he doesn't look like the type. He doesn't look like your stereotypical leader, but he is strong. What's the base of his strength? What is he trying to recreate? What has he captured in the Russian imagination that's brought him back to power over and over again?
Well, I think it's, you know, there was so much discontent with the Russian people, with people like Yeltsin, even with people like Gorbachev. Mm-hmm. So when Putin was finally elected, things actually started to get a little better. You know, depending on who you ask, you know, things did get better just because they were so terrible after the instation of capitalism in the Soviet Union, unemployment, prostitution, drug
and oligarchs and things like that.
Yeah,
right?
there is, you know, all these things went up.
There's a lot of corruption, right, that was going on. Yeah.
And that's still something that permeates Russian society today. But Putin, you know, in many ways, and his party did do some things, you know, that were reminiscent of the Soviet Union. For example, you know, they nationalized certain industries, which wasn't seen as a communist thing, wasn't seen as a Soviet thing, but just as a popular nationalist thing, kind of, for the Russian people. So he did a lot of popular things. And, I mean, unemployment has been relatively stable. You know, there have been some stabilizing effects of a Putin presidency.
I see. So he was finally, Yeltsin before him, I mean, people seemed to like him, but you got the impression that he wasn't, you know, corpus mentis all the time. He seemed like he drank a lot and, you know, didn't seem to be really, he let other people run things. And we've had presidents like that. I mean, Ronald Reagan was a little bit like that. I mean, he really just made the appearances on TV and everybody else did the work and nobody would actually trust him to do the work.
Yeah.
Right. How is let's relate this because, you know, I've had folks on from RT and different groups who first of all deny that Russia had any role in influencing an American election, which is believable to me because we have a 250-year-old democracy, and to say that another country with like no democracy, or you know, a democracy that's like 20 years old, basically, could knock us for a loop by putting like competing demonstrations on the same block and things like that, which is sort of cute. It's like a hippie thing, right?
Yeah.
Could actually affect the outcome. In the United, I mean, what are we saying about us? It's not really what we're saying about Russia.
Yeah.
It's what we're saying about if that's true. And I've yet to meet anybody who has any connections in the Russian hierarchy who believes such a thing was impossible, although they tend to like Trump. And just because you don't like Trump means you like Hillary.
Yeah.
I have to keep saying that to people. Just because I don't like Trump doesn't mean I like Hillary. I didn't like Hillary either. But I know a lot of people wanted to see a woman get elected. But anyway, that said, what is it about Trump and Russia? What is it that the two of them, they seem to be seeing eye to eye more than any other president and leader? I mean, Obama didn't see eye to eye. The famous reset that was supposed to happen with Hillary never happened.
Yeah.
Is there a reset happening now, or is it just continuation and just a lot of propaganda?
I think it's definitely, I mean, obviously the election of Donald Trump shook things up, to say the least.
Yeah.
And people kind of expected, one of the things he ran on was less intervention, foreign policy-wise. That is one of the things he ran on. Whether or not that's been realized, not exactly.
He made the bombs bigger.
Yeah.
He was dropping the same amount of bombs, and he just added 50 pounds of
yeah.
explosives each one.
So again, that was clearly meaningless. But there has been a change in dynamics with Russia a little bit in terms of focusing towards more dialogue, it seems, and focusing more towards cooperation when it comes to Russia, which is somewhat surprising to me. And that's something that I would never have expected from Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or anyone else that could have been elected president.
Yeah.
So while, I mean, he may talk better about Russia, that's really all it is when it comes to foreign policy.
It's really just talk.
Yeah.
Right. Although you have noticed some lessening of tension since he's been in there. And we don't know if that's really because he really has a different view of Russia, or he's looking towards, like, after he's out of being president or investing there. He always wanted to build a hotel in Moscow. I mean, he said that a million times. He wants those emails, 30,000 emails, Mr. Putin, right? Give them to me, right?
Yeah.
That was one of the most bizarre statements ever made in a political campaign in American history. Because it was basically the person who was campaigning to be president admitting on television to the commission of the crime of espionage. It is. I mean, like, technically, he committed espionage. You know, in the 1950s, Alger Hiss, had some, like, unclassified papers in a pumpkin?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
If you know the pumpkin, right? And they destroyed his life for that and put him in jail for 5 years, right, for nothing, right? So here you have the guy who's running for president. What's happening is Russia really has a, what's the model that Russia, which used to be the model of everything bad, what's the model today? What's it doing right?
Well, I mean, I think they're doing some things right. I think in terms of their foreign policy, they have some things definitely more right than we do. You know, when they're in Syria, for example, you know, what we're doing when we, you know, give billions of dollars to quote-unquote moderate rebels for regime change against Bashar al-Assad, you know, that's wrong. That money ends up in the wrong places, as do the weapons.
Right.
You know, when we provide so much money in arms and in other deals to Saudi Arabia, which, again, has been accused of financing, you know, groups like Daesh in Syria and across the Middle East.
Right.
And I think Russia provides a good counterweight to that, especially in Syria, to protect the sovereignty of Syria.
Right. And what lessons did they not learn from the revolution? What are they doing wrong now, you think?
Well, I mean, obviously they're not communist. You know, they're not socialist. Certain things in Russia could obviously be much better, you know. Problems that permeate all capitalist cultures continue to permeate in Russia and continue to be problems for the working class in Russia.
What is the at this point, with a minute to go, what do you think is the final? Is there a final, and what is it? The final solution of the whole communist attempt. I mean, how do people look at that?
Well, I think the main thing that we should be doing now is, you know, really trying to elevate people in the working class about their situation. You know, why is it that wages have been stagnant for so long? Why is it that wars continue to go on and military budgets continue to bloat while, you know, there's 11 homeless people for every house in this country?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, 11 homes for every homeless person.
Right.
Yeah.
But how about in Russia?
In Russia?
Yeah. What is their summation of the whole experience right now, or is it still in play?
Well, I mean, I think Vladimir Putin is really popular. Him and United Russia, his party, are very popular, and I think for the foreseeable future, we'll see Putin or Medvedev continue to be reelected.
Right. Knowing what happened in the last century, would Russian people today redo what they did 100 years ago?
I think it would take a lot of work.
All right, they're in a different mindset. Thank you very much, Dakotah Lillya, for joining us. It's been a very interesting program, and we'll have to have you on again because we just started to get into all this. I wanted to talk about Stalin and all these other things. We'll get to that. All right, another time we'll be on. All right, thanks very much. A lot of history, and we'll see you next week.